Hello, everybody. I hope you all are doing well after the Thanksgiving holiday. Welcome to the 8th Able Learning Session. It's hosted in partnership with Colorado Post and the Able Colorado team. We're so happy that all of you were able to join us today for this sample teach of the 2023 refresher curriculum. My name is Lindy Hoffman. I'm with the Able National team at the Georgetown University Law Center. Before we get started, I'd love to take a brief moment to introduce our two facilitators today, some of which you may recognize. So I'm going to start with Greg Hanna. Captain Gregory Hanna Jr. retired in 2020 from the Metro Transit Police Department in Washington, D.C. after 27 years of service. During his tenure with the department, he served in numerous leadership and command roles, which included leading the Honor Guard unit, commander of the Special Weapons and Tactics team, section commander of the K-9 unit, precinct commander, commander of the Criminal Investigations Division, watch commander, and commander of Internal Affairs. He is a graduate from the FBI National Academy Session 261 in Quantico, Virginia, as well as leadership in policing organizations. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Criminal Justice with a minor in Homeland Security from the University of Maryland University College. He has received multiple distinctions, which includes medals for meritorious and distinguished service. He possesses over 25 years of instructor experience administering national curriculums focused on bias-based profiling, implicit bias, ethical standards, officer-involved shootings, blue courage, and numerous academy-based law enforcement curricula. He is also a certified national instructor and leadership team member for the ABLE project. Paul Watkins is a captain with the Verona Police Department in New Jersey and has been in a supervisory role since 2011. The first 17 years of his career were spent in patrol, of which he is most proud, as he feels this is where you have the most contact with the public and can best serve the community. Paul now serves in an administration role, and some of his responsibilities include professional standards commander, in charge of the Detective Bureau, training, DV liaison, and accreditation manager. Paul also serves as a negotiator, CIT officer, SWAT operator, and New Jersey Police Training Commission Certified Police Academy instructor. He is also an experienced adjunct professor of various criminal justice programs at different colleges and universities. Paul has a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Caldwell University and a master's in criminal justice leadership from Northeastern University. Paul is a certified public manager and a graduate of the New Jersey State Association of Chiefs of Police Command and Leadership Academy, West Point Command School, as well as the FBI Supervisory Command and Executive Command Institutes to complete the FBI LEADA Trilogy program. Paul is an accredited command executive. He is also a certified national instructor for the ABLE project. So thank you both so much for being here with us today. We're so excited to have you. I will let you two take it away as soon as I get up the slides.
Thank you, Lindy.
No problem. Thank you, Lindy. It's fantastic to be here, everyone, and great to be here with my colleague Paul today. And hopefully you all will get some great teaching tips as we kind of have that peek behind the curtain moment, as we always do in our active bystandership for law enforcement training. So Paul, anything you want to say to the group before we get started?
No, just welcome. Happy to have you here. Happy for this opportunity to run you through this refresher. We're going to a couple times throughout this program, we may pause and give you a different viewpoint that you're going to have that's different from your students, especially when it comes down to group discussions, individual exercises, things of that nature. So if we take pause for a moment, it's for that reason, and we'll discuss how we go about those. Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, awesome. We also, the way we're going to kind of do today is we're going to do a walkthrough, obviously, of this reinforced module, 2023 module, but we're also going to have some interaction. So just like how we do in the classroom, we will have some discussion that we will ask you all here in the group that's in attendance. And of course, if you have any questions, anything like that, please feel free to put it there in the chat. And also we will have a Q&A session at the end of today's session in order to answer any other questions. If we do not get to your question in the chat right away, know that we will definitely get to it. But either way, you can use the chat as a whiteboard, just how we do in the classroom. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. This is the 2023 Reinforced module, and the focus of this year's module is on early intervention. Now, if we can go to the next slide. And we'll start off this module with the 3 fundamental pillars and foundational pillars of ABLE. And you all have seen this before. And so as your students, this is their reintroduction to these three pillars that they covered in the 8-hour block of instruction. And of course, as we know, ABLE is founded on these three pillars to prevent misconduct, avoid mistakes, and promote officer health and wellness. And we know that these three pillars are often intertwined. For example, when sleep deprivation kind of contributes to an officer's mistake, or when an act of misconduct that causes harm that impacts their mental health, on any officer who witnesses misconduct, but didn't step in to stop it. And so these pillars are very important. It's important to also reinforce these pillars. And as we kind of look at all of the different things that law enforcement professionals encounter, it will likely fall under one of these three pillars. As a reminder, these three pillars are of equal plane. You notice that one is not higher than the other. And so as you discuss this with your students, you want to reinforce the fact that all three of these pillars have to be addressed. You can't just address one, because sometimes that unwellness in a law enforcement professional leads to a mistake, and a mistake can lead to misconduct. And so all three of these pillars are equally important. If we can go to the next slide, please. And this is also familiar here as well. And it's what we talk about here is what ABLE is about. And remember, at its core, ABLE is all about preventing harm. And so that means that it's showing everyone is empowered to intervene. They know how to intervene and to prepare to intervene and accept interventions when needed. As we covered in the 8-hour block of instruction, we often train, and we know that we have a duty to intervene, and that's usually through policies and procedures. So one of the things to reinforce here with your students is to let them know that what is different about ABLE, and this is, again, just a reminder, what's different is that we're training to do it with consistency. We're training to have a tool in the toolbox to be able to intervene to prevent any form of harm. And so ABLE is about empowering and authorizing law enforcement professionals to intervene when they see some type of harm emerging, regardless of the rank or regardless of experience. And as you all know, rank is one of those inhibitors that we talked about in the 8-hour module. ABLE is also about teaching how to intervene and accept that intervention successfully. So what's important about this slide and talking about that specific thing is that, number one, you know that you have a duty to intervene. We also want to let your students know that the second part of this ingredient, which is the important ingredient, is creating that culture that makes intervention acceptable. ABLE is also about protecting those who do intervene from negative repercussions, because they help to intervene and prevent that harm at the earliest possible stage. And then, of course, again, as I mentioned, creating that culture that expects and supports and celebrates good intervention techniques. A key part of this is making sure that the agency has a culture of active bystandership, where interventions are expected, supported, and even celebrated. If we can go to the next slide, please. And you all will be familiar with this saying here: early is best, but never late than never. If you all remember, in 8-hour block of instruction, we covered extensively a time-based intervention framework, where the earlier that you intervene in a situation, the earlier it is to stop harm. But of course, as the situation continues to develop, if the intervention doesn't happen early, the difficulty of harm that's inflicted and the difficulty of the intervention becomes a little bit greater. So intervening is never easy, but the longer a situation goes on, intervening only becomes harder, and the harm only becomes greater. And so the goal, as we are focusing on this module, is that early intervention, right? Trying to do it at the earliest possible stage, and whenever possible, and of course, whenever safe. You want to reiterate to your students that you should intervene as soon as you notice that there's a need to do so, or you notice that there's some harm that's emerging. And if you miss the earliest opportunity to intervene, every moment becomes your next best and earliest opportunity, even as the event is unfolding. So you want to make sure that you cover that with your students and make sure that they understand that process. We can go to the next slide, please. And you all should be very familiar with this here, right? So this is just retouching one of the frameworks that we covered in 8-hour blocks of instruction, which is to notice what's happening ourselves, notice what's happening in others when they get into that heightened state of emotion. And as we go further into this, we'll dive a little bit into that notice part a little bit further. I'm going to touch a little bit on brain science today, kind of a recap there. And then, of course, once you notice what happened to yourself and others, and you notice the harm that's emerging, now the next step is deciding how you're going to intervene and when is going to be the best opportunity to intervene. And then, of course, the last part of this framework is act. And how do you act? How do you intervene? And if you remember, ACT has kind of a two-step process, right? Where number one, you prepare to have the conversation with the person or your colleague, and the second step is to have the conversation, and the ways that you show up in having a conversation, whether it be nonverbal, verbal, or a combination of both. And we'll dive a little bit more into that here in a little bit. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Paul, and he's going to now start to walk us through some other areas that we covered in 8-hour block instructions, specifically the 3Ds of intervention. Paul?
Perfect. Thank you, Greg. Again, you guys are familiar with this, the 3Ds, a lot of threes in the ABLE curriculum. We have the direct approach, distract, and delegate. Your students should remember this, or your fellow officers, but reiteration of what we've covered already. The direct approach, just as it is, it's addressing the behavior head on. This can be a simple example of a hand on the shoulder, calling the person out, calling their name, redirecting that attention somewhere else, or giving them that moment as we get into the science Greg talked about to just cool off and reset. We talk about the use of an agency reminder word. If you want to use ABLE, if you want to use any other terminology that you guys are comfortable with, as long as everybody's on the same page and aware of that, that's enough to wake them up. That could be that first step. Distract is another option. What you're doing there is you're redirecting the person's attention elsewhere. And that could be simply asking them to take care of another assignment for you. Hey, can you go get the lieutenant for me? That's, again, just taking their focus off of where they are at the moment and have them have the ability to regain their breath, reorient their focus, and maybe come out of what they're going into. Now, when we delegate, we're not kicking it off. We're steering the ship still, but we're seeking allies. We're enlisting those allies. Maybe we're not in the best position relationship-wise with that individual. So what do? We find somebody who is. Now, could be a peer, it could be another supervisor, whoever it may be. So when we delegate, we're bringing the matter to the attention of another person, and it's a group effort. Big point of delegation, or one thing we have to remember too, though, is with that delegation, if we do take this route, we do have to follow up and see what the outcome was. So direct, distract, and delegate. Next slide, please. We talk about early's best, better later than never. There's many benefits to early intervention. Obviously, the first one is the opportunity to stop the harm before it occurs. Conversations are less stressful when harm is not imminent. There's less stress involved, right? Things are starting to head south, but it's not quite there. We can operate in an optimal environment in that situation. Early on also gives us more time to plan that intervention. What steps are we going to take? We talk about delegate, distract, right? And those different approaches, but you have more time on your side. More time equals more options for how and when we're going to intervene. We want to find that right time in that right place, enlist those allies, gather more information so that we can make the best possible choices in our intervention options. And this also makes it normalize early intervention as part of the agency culture, as Greg touched on. Culture is huge. This doesn't work if it's not ingrained in the culture. So if it's early on and that's the norm, that's how we get that strengthening the culture for the ABLE approach. Next slide. So here we would have our first group discussion in this refresher training, and we would have the group break out, give them a couple minutes to come up with a couple options to this question. So what inhibitors might stop us from intervening at the earliest signs of trouble? So somebody would just amuse us here, raise your virtual hand, talk about some of those inhibitors. Remember, those things that get in the way of taking that intervention action. We'll go the approach. Joel? Remember the original curriculum, inhibitors was a big part of that program, right? These are the things that get in the way. Why the good people don't do the right thing all the time. What do you say, man?
Fear of making a mistake.
Right. Fear of making a mistake. Let's give me one more and then we'll move on.
Dealing with a supervisor and feeling uncomfortable, or a senior deputy, people are not comfortable doing that if they're a younger deputy or inexperienced.
Absolutely. That's a true concern, a real concern. That's a monumental hurdle that we got to get over, dealing with that senior officer. But if we could advance to the next slide. Some other reasons people don't intervene, some of those inhibitors, uncertainty about whether there's really a problem or whether it's serious. There's some self-doubt there. We teach this in the original program, that if you're thinking there's an issue, you're most likely right. Trust your instincts and explore those options. Thinking that someone else will handle it. This was a major outcome of the Lopez case study, that diffusion of responsibility. Someone else is going to do it. Why should I have to? And we saw in that case study, and we've seen in our careers, that's maybe not the best approach, because if no one steps in, that harm is still taking place. No one wanted to overstep boundaries or be perceived as nosy. That could be with rank, that could be with gender, that could be with assignment. You don't want to step on toes. We all know that ego is a big killer. So this is what plays into that. We got to check our egos at the door and look out for our fellow officers as well as ourselves. Not knowing what to say or do, that could come down to comfort, that could come down to experience or lack thereof. So again, this is why this training is important, right? Giving options. As many options as possible opens up the many ways in which we can intervene. Wanting to avoid potential conflict with a colleague. You don't want to upset people. You don't want to have it affect the relationships or the morale of an organization. But we all know too that failing to intervene will bring down some negative outcomes that's going to impact the agency as well as the individual officers. Maybe you have a culture of toughness and endurance. This is a huge killer when it comes down to the health and wellness aspect. No one wants to speak up. Nobody wants to seek help. Nobody wants to intervene in someone else's life. But we know that that is not the best approach, and that intervention can help get people the help that they need. And finally, here we have burnout or compassion fatigue. And I'm sure some in this room and those officers you're going to be instructing, they've had that before. And that is that simply just not caring anymore. It's not my problem. But we know that that is not an excuse to step in and do what needs to get done. So again, inhibitors, huge, something we really need to highlight on in this refresher and in our everyday lives when we're working. But Greg's going to go into some of the science behind why things don't get done or people don't intervene at that moment.
Thanks, Paul. And I just want to take a quick moment just as a kind of another peek behind the curtain moment. Just like in the 8R curriculum, the module here does have different segments. Okay, so when you get into your facilitator's guide, it's going to break down what segments you're going to be entering and what the focus is of that segment. So this segment focuses on the benefits of early intervention and inhibitors of early intervention. And as Paul talked about, it's important that we revisit the inhibitors, because those inhibitors are the things that get in the way of good, effective intervention. And in the 8R curriculum, as you remember, you and even as you teach this to your students, they're going to be going through revisiting those things again. So rank, gender roles, all of the different things that were listed there in the PowerPoint is examples. And those lists can be long. When you're in the classroom and you're teaching this module, it's reinforced module, you can do it in a couple of different ways. Obviously, it's a large group discussion, but you can also kind of go old school a little bit. If you have a white erase board where you have a flip chart, you can actually write down these inhibitors and keep them visually in front of your students. If you're doing this by Zoom or electronic version of that, whether it be either Zoom or whether it be Teams, they do have whiteboard features that you can actually do these things in. So you want to try to make sure that this is interactive, especially these large group discussions. And then as Paul and I get through, we're going to start talking about some table discussions as well. Although for the purposes of today, we're going to treat them as large group discussions, but these discussions are important to get your students to engage and get them to start revisiting some things that they covered in the 8-hour block of instruction. Okay, so along with identifying, as Paul walked through, what the inhibitors are, and why that is important to identify those things that help you to navigate in early intervention techniques. It's also important for us to talk about what are some types of situations that you've encountered on the job where emotions are likely to run high. And these are situations where, you get into a heightened state of emotion, where stress starts to come into play, and what is happening to our body. This is the part where we start to talk about noticing ourselves and others. So this is the retouch or revisit of what's happening with ourselves and others. And if we know what's happening with ourselves, we know what the situation is that's getting you into a high state of emotion, it helps you to be able to control the situation, and more importantly, be able to intervene at the earliest signs when you notice it either in yourself or you notice it in your colleagues. So anyone, raise your virtual hand. Give me some examples. What are some types of situations you have encountered on the job where emotions are likely to run high, where stress is likely to build up? Raise your virtual hand. And it's okay, just like in the 8-hour block instruction, love sitting in silence. All right, Robin, how about you? Come off your mute. Do you have any situations, any types of situation you encounter on a job that are likely to, where emotions are likely to run kind of high?
That's funny because we're actually dealing with one right now, but it's our newer officers seem to do really well with intervening when they're out doing their job, but the interpersonal relationships, we have a very young department and there's a lot of dating among people, which adds drama, and nobody's really willing to step up in those interpersonal issues.
Okay.
That can lead to bigger problems, as we're now seeing. So
Okay.
I'm frustrated because I'm like, I teach ABLE and you guys can't do this in the interpersonal when it's within the house, but outside of the house, they do fine. But so that's where we're kind of sitting right now.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that, Robin. And you bring up a very important point that we talk about, at least I know I talk about a lot. I know Paul has talked about in the 8-hour curriculum when we do the trainers, and even when we do 8 hours, is that, you know, we possess the tools already to do what we're doing. There's nothing like super revolutionary here. You have observation skills, you have communication skills, and we use those skills very effectively when it comes to dealing with the public at large, right? We know how to deconflict situations. We know how to diffuse a situation. It may not necessarily be to everyone's liking, but nonetheless, there's some form of resolution that comes from that deconfliction. But where we struggle and have the problem is applying those exact same skills, or communication skills, those observation skills, and applying them to each other when we see each other in some type of crisis. Now, that's not for everyone, right? Not everyone has that barrier or that inhibitor, but it is in fact an inhibitor, right? And maybe that relationship may not necessarily be okay with that person. Maybe you don't know that person. And of course, we got framework for that, what we call the 3Ds, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But yeah, you bring up a really important point, Robin, and that's something that could definitely create a situation where emotions can run high, right? Because that can spill over into incidents. So thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate that. Not to put you on the spot, but Darren, what types of situations have you encountered on the job where emotions are likely to run high?
Usually they involve some type of use of force incident where the officer goes from being a police officer and unfortunately into a life or death situation. They come out of that police role where you show professionalism and you get into just a survive mode, and that tends to lead to bad decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's what we call, which we're going to cover here in a little bit, is kind of that amygdala hijack, right? You're in that fight, flight, or freeze. You get in that heightened state of emotion, and that can absolutely create some problems. So thank you for sharing that, Darren. And Donna put in the chat, crimes involving children or large crowds. Yeah, absolutely. If we can go ahead and advance to the next slide, we'll see a couple examples here in addition to the ones that were already given, but this is some other ones, right? So large crowds we talked about. How about foot pursuits and vehicle pursuits, right? Or someone challenging or questioning your authority, right? Defying your authority. Or certain types of calls, like as Donna talked about with children, maybe large crowds, and of course, pressure to quickly clear a scene. You might be getting pressure from someone higher up to try to clear a scene and get through it. So these can be intensely stressful in these particular situations. And of course, this list can be longer. When you're doing this in the class, it's important to kind of flesh this discussion out, because this is where you start to really explore what's happening with yourself and others, and what situation is getting you into a heightened state of emotion. And in turn, you can detect at the earliest possible stages how to intervene. I'm going to turn this over to Paul now, and he's going to touch on another large discussion here where we talk about some of the physical signs.
Thanks, Greg. All right, folks. So again, we're going to have this large discussion with your students. You know, we're going to ask this question for them, give them a couple moments to come up with some responses. And what are some of the physical signs that someone may be experiencing heightened stress or emotion? And what might you notice in that moment? So again, behind the curtain for a moment, your class will go out. They'll think about this in that large group, and then they'll come back. We'll see a couple responses before going into what the curriculum is going to include. So with that, I'm going to go to Christian. Give me one physical sign that somebody might be experiencing or going through some heightened stress, either in
Increased,
their personal lives or out on the field.
increased respiration.
Okay. Increased respiration. Their breathing is increasing. It's becoming more rapid. Somebody says crying. Thank you for that. Yes. Maybe they have a breakdown. It's overwhelming and they begin to tear up and cry. That is a response to the extremely heightened stress. And give me one more. Robin?
Being angry, unusually angry.
Okay. And with that, how's that? That's your baseline that you're usually angry, or?
I said if they're unusually angry.
Okay.
So if they become more irritable over things that don't elicit that type of reaction.
Absolutely. Does the response match the resistance or what they're facing at that time? That's something that we really want to keen in because it's an off behavior, and that may be a sign we may want to intervene. Also added laughing. I could relate to that, just it's a response. Maybe it's not normal to the situation at hand. But if we go to the next slide, we'll see some more here. We talked about that breathing, tensed up body, real rigid, right? You're getting into that possible fight, flight, or freeze situation. Clenched fist, yes, very clear sign. If we see that in one of our fellow officers, or if we catch that on ourselves, that's something that needs to be addressed because nothing good is going to come out of that. So we want to stop those officers from engaging in that behavior for their own benefit and for that of the agency. Shaky or unsteady voice. Their nerves are starting to get to them. They're starting to lose control. That could be one sign. Flushed face. Maybe they have a red face. I talk with my classes about how I have this thing where my jaw, I start clenching my teeth and you could see it going. And I always tell my officers, if you see that, that's not good. You need to help me. So these are what we're looking for. If we know those we're working for, we know their signs. But again, if we don't know the signs of the individual officer, as Robin correctly stated, when you start seeing things that are not matching what they're facing, that should be a sign and a red flag that maybe it's a good idea to start working toward a plan for intervention. And then finally, freezing up. If someone's freezing up, you don't know what's going to happen, but you're also leaving that officer susceptible to anything that comes at them. So that's why we're going to want to step in and take action to reduce the likelihood of harm being inflicted. So again, this is just it's not going to be as quick as we presented it here because you're going to be going around the room with your students and they're going to be giving more options to what those signs are, things maybe they've experienced, things maybe that they've seen out in the field, and have those discussions and let that discussion go round and round, getting everybody involved. Greg?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And just as a kind of to piggyback off of that, remember, just like in the 8-hour block of instruction, you may get some responses and you got to be prepared for those responses because a lot of times your officers are going to be talking about things that are happening, current events that are going to be happening in the now that they may have recently experienced. So just kind of like how Robin just talked about not long ago about some things that you're currently experiencing in your department, those things may come out because remember, we're now beyond the 8-hour curriculum. It is more, or at least there should be more awareness and a little bit more mindfulness in your classroom. So just remember that and keep that in the back of your mind because, these discussions can bring out a few things. All right, if we go to the next slide, you all should be familiar with this. If you all remember, this is the fight, flight, or freeze. You all remember seeing this. It's called the amygdala hijack. And we spoke about that fight, flight, or freeze response in the initial 8-hour curriculum. And everything that we just talked about in the slides before that Paul talked about are really those indicators of that response, which takes away from the thinking and the decision-making process. And you may remember from the initial training that this response is also called that amygdala hijack. And it's important, even though this is sciencey, there's an easy way to just kind of look at this. And the easy way that I have found in the classroom, so think about this, is what is happening to you when you're upset? Have you ever had a situation where you get upset or you get in a high state of emotion and you say, man, I was so mad. I was seeing red, that's what a hijack kind of looks like. And so a great way to kind of look at this particular slide without getting too much into the science is looking at that blue part of the brain. And this is how you should probably explain it to your students. That is the higher cortex. That's kind of the shell. That's kind of like your cap. And so when you're not in a heightened state of emotion, you're in more of a low emotion response, right? So you're calm, you're relaxed. And that higher cortex, that blue area, is really kind of covering the feeling part of the brain and that little small area, which is the amygdala. But when you're in a heightened state of emotion, and when you get into stressful situations like we just talked about, that higher cortex becomes disabled. So it's almost like that emotion becomes an override of that higher cortex. And then you get into this level of excitement. That's where you have frustration. That's where love actually comes into play, even though that's, for a lot of folks is a good feeling. It could be a bad feeling. You also have fear that kind of overrides. And so when you're in this space, it just disables that higher cortex. And so now you're in that amygdala. You could be in a fight, flight, or freeze. And we can help counter the effects. ABLE helps to counter effects of the amygdala by planning how we will intervene ahead of time. And we can stay prepared to intervene by maintaining situational awareness. So this is an important slide to cover. This is not something that you want to just gloss over. You want to kind of dive into this a little bit. And the easiest way that I found to dive into this segment, if you haven't already found a great technique to do it, is to talk about what's happening with a person in the moment. One of the simplest examples that I like to give in the classroom is saying, hey, has anyone ever come up behind you before and scared you? And so if you've ever had that feeling before, what happens to you? Well, you get that heightened state of emotion. You get shortness of breath. Your heart drops. You have that moment where you're like, oh my God, what's going on? And so what your body is doing in that moment is it's preparing. It's in that fight, flight, or freeze. It's doing what your body is programmed to do and how it's built, and preparing the body for some type of emotional state or that fight, flight, or freeze situation. So nice little way to just kind of lay it out to everyone and get them to revisit that and kind of understand what's happening in these heightened state of emotions. We can go to the next slide, please. And of course, there's three things that really helps with this process, right? And of course, it's having a situation awareness. And situation awareness is something that we do all the time. I think we all kind of practice this all the time. But there are things that get in the way. And that heightened state of emotion, when you get into that hijacked brain, well, that situation awareness kind of goes away. And so here we're just going to be talking about practicing the skill when we're in a situation where people are likely to be in heightened stress. And this type of response can make it more likely that a situation will escalate and an intervention might be needed. And so here's three key takeaways from this, right? Is number one, be on the lookout for the signs of heightened stress. And it's not just heightened stress in your fellow officers or community members, but it's also that heightened stress within yourself, having self-awareness and knowing that, hey, I am in a position where I'm in this heightened state of emotion. The other part of this, and this is the training part of this, is to be prepared, right? So to intervene if the person's response is unnecessary escalating. So if you see this in a colleague and you notice that the interaction between your colleague and a citizen or the person that they're engaging with is not quite proportionally equal, meaning let's say that the citizens or the person that they're engaging with is at, let's say, 20% of emotion, but your partner or your colleague is at maybe 60% or 80%. They're elevated. Is that warranted, right? Is what they're encountering warranted that heightened state of emotion? And if it isn't, what's causing that? So be on the lookout. You want to prepare. And the last thing you want to remember, you may not have all the whole picture. There may be some other things that are going on. Remember that spillover effect that you talk about in 8-hour block instruction. Maybe something may have happened outside of work that spills over into work and vice versa. And so it may be due to some type of past experience. It may be some type of trauma. So if you all remember primary and secondary trauma, and you remember PTSD, some of those things could carry over into situations. So having those situation awareness, being on the lookout, being prepared, and remembering that you might not have the whole picture of the situation helps identify in the earliest intervention stages. And so Paul's going to walk us through some early intervention, noticing the very first signs of heightened state of emotion. Paul?
Thanks, Greg. So again, we talked earlier when we started this refresher early's best, better later than never. We talk about the strengths of why we intervene early, and that's the increased options, right? Little less stress involved. Not saying it's easy though, not by any means. We all understand that. It may sound difficult trying to find when interventions are needed, but we all of us in this room and all those that you're going to be instructing, they've had times where somebody they knew well was off. Something was off in their lives, right? It's that spidey sense, it's those gut instincts that you all have, which makes you effective at your jobs. So when you know someone well or have spent a lot of time with them, you may notice initial signs that are hard to put into words. Sometimes something just feels off, and we can't really describe what that is. But it's through this cultural element of the ABLE project and the ABLE and the interventions and the discussions and the culture where we can have conversations with one another and kind of dive into what's going on. You know, we talk about in the 8 hour, if it's nothing, great. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. We can talk about it. But put yourselves in the shoes of somebody who's in need. Wouldn't you rather have somebody err on the side of caution for your benefit than to not, and then just see what happens, right? We don't want to roll the dice because we know what can possibly happen in those situations where tragedies occur. So deciding if, when, and how to intervene, it can be tough, especially when you're considering acting before anything too serious has occurred. Yes, that is difficult. But remember to the saying in the 8 hour block, you know, the greatest success of ABLE is all those negative stories you don't hear about because nothing bad ever happened. That is the whole point of this project, and the whole point of these principles is getting in before it's too late, right? Before that harm has taken place or started down that path where we can't stop it. So it may help to consider what specifically you have noticed and what might happen if the situation continues unchecked. So again, we're getting our officers' minds to start thinking a little bit longer term, not just in that moment. Yes, it may be uncomfortable now, but then you go your separate ways. But God forbid something negative occurs to that officer and it's something that you could have intervened. That's not what we want to be left with. So by intervening early, you can help head off an issue before it develops into a major problem. We talked about what ABLE's not, you know, it's not about reporting, but if we can stave off that issue, right, and minimize the risk and prevent it from getting to that point where something is reportable or something negative occurs, that's what we're looking for, and that's why it's so important. Next slide, please. So how are we going to do this? What's the starting blocks here? You're preparing for that intervention. Again, early, you have more options. You have more time, right? You may have delegation or enlisting those allies. So you need to decide who will intervene. Is it going to be you yourselves? Is it going to be an ally through that delegation? Or is it going to be you with that ally you've enlisted? So who's going to do it? Then the next step is when. When are you going to intervene? Does it need to be done right at this moment? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Can it be deferred to a later time? This is why early is great, because now you have a little bit of time on your side to really dissect this issue. And then you're going to decide how you're going to intervene. You got to look at safety, strategy, the approach. How are you going to best deliver your message to this person? These are the things we want you and you to get across to your officers that we need to really think about, so that we have the greatest chances of success of not only preventing harm, but also if that officer needs further assistance down the line, how we're going to go about to best serve that officer and the organization. Next slide. So coming up with that game plan, you know, we teach our officers to tactically prepare, you know, run through certain calls you're going to respond to. How are you going to approach that building on a armed robbery call? How are you going to enter into the space or the residence of a domestic violence call to ensure safety? All critically important. But we also have to look at how we're going to take our approaches to these interventions with our colleagues. That's part of that planning and preparation that, again, you have that benefit when you have time on your side. If we know our colleagues' personal stressors, we'll keep you mindful of when you're heading into a situation where it may be more likely you'll need to intervene. If there's people you work with regularly, talk to them about their stressors in your own. This is part of that culture, having those open conversations, that lines of communication remain open so that you can discuss. This is where you're going to be able to establish what the baseline is and what's out of the ordinary so that you're best prepared. You know, it's having your ears open all the time, And we understand, of course, this is difficult with everything else going on in your personal lives, your professional lives, but this is how we want our officers to start looking at their colleagues as well as themselves. So you want to make a plan on how you want to address these situations, or how you will address these situations that cause a heightened stress response, right? All about planning and preparation for that best possible outcome. And thinking this through beforehand can help keep everyone safe when you're in a high stress situation, rather than finding yourself in that stressful situation at the moment and then having to run through that stress and come up with a game plan of how you're going to respond. Obviously, we're going to have to do something, but planning and preparation is key to the success overall for both your peers, your organization, as well as yourself. Next slide. So this block here is going to close off with another group discussion that you're going to send your officers out to kick around. And this is going to be a scenario-based exercise. It's a domestic violence call. And what you want these students and your officers to think about is you're heading into a call for service in which a woman has alleged that her husband has just severely beaten her. Your partner told you that she grew up in a violent household and that DV calls are very challenging for her. So we have a little bit of an issue there. Your partner, who's going to be responding with you, is letting you know that this type of call is problematic for her because of her experiences. So in the group, we're going to ask you folks, what does your conversation sound like on the way to the call? And how do you make sure that you both feel confident and prepared to handle this situation that you're dispatched to? Paul, I'm going to throw this on you. So I'm your partner. We're going to that call, and I expressed to you that I grew up in a very violent household, and that because of that, you know, I have a tough time in responding to domestic violence calls.
Well, I'm just going to say that because of that, I'm going to be the point person. I'm going to be the one taking the lead and dealing with people, and that you're just going to be my a backup type of person, just standing back. I'll probably also call for another call or another car, another deputy to come out to respond as well, so that when the backup or another car gets there, that they can maybe go separate, deal with the other party in the case, and have you stand back and just be a third party. And if it gets to a point where it gets overwhelming, then just leave the residence, go to the car, go outside, to just keep you right away from the situation.
It's excellent, man. A lot of great options there. You know, you talked about it, you expressed and you acknowledged your partner's concern, but then you still had the job to do, and you were able to come up with a game plan in which you can address the call at hand, but also look out for your partner's well-being, and also involving them in that call, you know, asking that they be more of a backup supportive role, bringing in an additional resource to maybe serve as that second party with the other involved person in this call. So again, these are great options to address this with that concern in hand. Peter?
I got the flu or COVID yesterday. That's why I've had my video. I've been blowing my nose. I apologize.
Good, man.
Yeah. I like Paul was saying, that's a good idea, but then you're gonna almost have to take it a step further, because we go on domestic disturbance calls on a daily basis. So at that point, I think you're gonna have to talk to a supervisor, because I mean, if this guy, domestic ones are usually one of the most dangerous ones we go to. We can't have somebody freezing because they've had experience, because they grew up to something like that. So it's definitely something that needs to be brought up with a supervisor.
No, and that's a key point there. You know, we're addressing the situation at hand, how to best handle it in everybody's interest, but certainly follow-up is in order. You know, your partner first, what type of resources can we offer? How can we help them? Is this an issue of training, or do we need more professional help? Because you're right. This is a type of call that is one of the most dangerous, and something that's just unfortunately going to continue on and on and on. So after that call's cleared, you know, having those conversations, what can I do for you in the situation to help you handle these calls better? You know, and again, if you need to get a supervisor involved in this situation, you know, this is all about helping your officer so that they're not struggling through their job, and providing them that support that they need. So these are good conversations that you're going to have in your class, you know, but regardless of the situation and how the response is, we are all in agreement, and your officers will also be in agreement that this is something that needs to be addressed. It's not a thing that you could just go by the wayside, because what is some of the negatives that could come out of this? You know, you can have now that partner who's expressed this concern overreact to a type of situation, and now it may be an improper use of force, and now harm's being placed upon that person. Remember, it doesn't matter if there's that old school thought that they deserved it. Harm is harm. If it's not appropriate, it's not right. There's no excuse for that. But you're also leaving that officer in jeopardy of themselves, where their behaviors are going to impact their own well-being in their careers. So this is what we want the officers to discuss through this group discussion. I would imagine that this scenario is going to generate a lot of discussion on different options that are available. And each of those is going to be great, because what they're doing is they're thinking about how they're going to handle this, rather than just going, let's see what happens. You know, it has to be addressed, and you can address this in numerous ways. So with that, again, conversation is what's driving this. Greg's going to give you some tips on how we can steer that conversation in the ways that we need it to be.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And, you know, Peter, to your point, which I'm going to cover here in a second, you know, part of what you talked about is so important, and it's also about kind of closing the conversation and a follow-up. And this kind of goes into the third step of the framework of the 3 steps of ABLE, which is the Notice Aside Act. And so here's a couple of tips in addition to what you all have provided so far, which are fantastic conversations. Here's a couple other tips to have a really effective conversation. And first off, I think we know, and this is where we kind of have some trouble with, is being direct, but being gentle at the same time. And the reason why I say sometimes that can be challenging is because of those inhibitors, right? Let's say rank is at play. Let's say gender role is at play. And so those inhibitors can oftentimes be issues for effective conversations. So you want to try to navigate that and have these conversations, overcoming those inhibitors. And you want to be gentle, but you also want to be direct in your approach, because this is an important thing, especially in that scenario where it can have an impact on not just your colleague or your partner, but it can have an impact on you and the people that's being served in that moment, in that moment of crisis. You want to ask open-ended questions. You know, want to give your partner room to offer some types of suggestions on their own, and not necessarily be forceful in the conversation and making specific suggestions to them, like as if you're kind of in this overseer mode. You want to kind of meet them where they are. And so when you're in a classroom, make sure that your students are understanding that these are some great ways to be able to approach a conversation, especially in difficult times or difficult situations. You also want to have your students acknowledge that, you know, you want to respect your partner's needs, while also ensuring that it's safe for everyone. Having a frank conversation with them lets them know that, hey, you are, you know, a part of this situation as well. So everyone needs to be safe, to include them, to include you, to include the folks that you're interacting with. And then, of course, the last thing here, and this is not really in any particular order, but the last tip here is, you know, if the topic seems to be too difficult or too personal for your partner to discuss, you can always come back later on with an ally or partner. So remember the other framework, the 3 Ds, and the specific D is that delegate or delegate, right? You're not saying, hey, you know, Joel, you go ahead and take care of the situation. I can't deal with Paul in this situation. You're actually going and saying, hey, you know, Joel, I know that you have a better relationship with Paul than I do. I'm noticing some things. These are some of the things that just recently came up. They confided in me about, you know, maybe a DV call or something. So, you know, but I know you have a better relationship with Paul. So maybe we can work together to try to talk to Paul and find a great outcome to this, because I'm worried about Paul's safety. I'm worried about my safety and those around. And so I want to make sure that Paul's in a good space and we're providing everything that we can to try to help Paul out during this difficult time. So again, this is some great effective conversation to illustrate to your students and get them into practicing doing it if they're not already doing it, but get them into practice to doing this. If we go to the next slide, please. And, you know, this is important too, right? This is just some sample conversations here, because some people may not necessarily know how to approach the conversation. They may know that they need to approach the conversation, but not quite sure how to approach the conversation in this sample DV call. And so you could just simply say, hey, partner, or hey, such and such. Hey, I know you said that DV calls are a little tough for you. So let's talk while we're rolling up on the scene to make sure that we're all on the same page with this? What are some things that I can do? You want me to take contact on this one. And really, this kind of speaks to a little bit of what Ramona put there in the chat. Ramona says in the chat, I will have my partner handle the victim and ask what I can do to make it an easier call. I love it. As you see here in this sample conversation, this really kind of goes in a discussion. So Ramona, fantastic. You're already on that page. But sometimes, again, our colleagues may not necessarily know how to have that conversation. So again, these are sample conversations. You're giving us some ideas and some suggestions to really talk about how these conversations will look. And having a game plan ahead of time to approach a situation when you know you're walking into a heightened state of emotion. If we go to the next slide, please. And of course, this kind of goes to what Peter was talking about here, is closing out the conversation. You want to make sure that you finish the conversation with a plan. And the key point in all of this, that you want to make sure that you have a clear plan whenever you're headed into a situation that is likely to lead to a heightened stress response. And of course, you may need to adapt as the situation develops, but it can also be very helpful to talk through likely scenarios ahead of time and think through how you're going to react strategically in a moment. And, to be quite honest, that's a skill that we already possess, right? Because most of the time we're going into a situation and we're doing a tactical analysis before we even get there. So it's no different than having this discussion and an analysis type of discussion with your colleague or a person that might be experiencing some type of primary secondary trauma to a type of call, or more than likely get into a heightened state of emotional or stressful situation. So I'm going to turn this over to Paul now. And, as we talked about in the 3 steps of ABLE, right, in that act phase is number 1, to prepare to have a conversation. Number 2 is to have the conversation. And so Paul's going to touch on that.
Thanks, Greg. So folks, the next 3 slides are going to be individual exercises. This first being a tabletop, and then we're going to go into a partner activity, and then we're going to go into an individual activity with your officers. So with this table team activity, this tabletop exercise, I want you to look here. You're in a squad with a rookie officer who seems overwhelmed by the job. And how? By the hours that they have to keep, the paperwork and the calls they're encountering. They're getting more and more stressed out, and you're very worried that they may wash out of this career. In this exercise, we'll just go through it as we've been doing here. How are you going to approach a conversation with that rookie officer that you now in your mind have concern over, and you've even raised it up to the point where now you think an intervention is in order? How are we going to approach this? Peter, you have concerns for this younger officer, all the stress that they're going through. How's this conversation look?
I would just be direct with them. Just be like, listen, I've noticed you've been getting overwhelmed. I know we've been getting a lot of paperwork. I'll help you with some of the paperwork just to alleviate some of the stress you're doing, but just find out if they're getting some sleep just because they're tired by the hours, and just maybe some of the calls they've been seeing. Maybe it's been some death scenes and it's starting to kind of get to them, or something where maybe you do have to have an intervention where incident support services maybe need to come talk to him and see where his mindset is.
Okay, I like it, because what's going on here is a lot. So what you're doing is you're taking a direct approach through conversation to really try to drill down what are the specifics that they're having trouble with, and you're even offering some support. But you're also acknowledging that maybe this is something that may not be in your hands, that you're not best suited to deal with. And that is a reality in a lot of these situations. So remember, we talk about in the 8-hour, it's not your job to fix per se, but it's to listen and almost be a facilitator to those resources that the officer might need. A couple comments in the chat here. Being honest, good environment, absolutely. You want it to be private. Darren, you mentioned the coffee shop. You want to elaborate on that? I'm assuming that's more for the laid back, welcoming approach. Asking about how they're adapting to the squad and being direct about what they're seeing. Yes, these are all excellent points. What we really want to hit on here is you're acknowledging the discomfort or the difficult time that they're having. Okay. And then you're going to work toward that early intervention before this spirals out of control. This right here is a recipe for disaster. You know, best case scenario is you lose an officer. He leaves the field, he or she leaves that field, and they go on, and it's something that we could have corrected and gotten them on the right path, because we all know too well that right now we're struggling to find good people. So we certainly can't be losing them. On the far extreme side, we all know what that negative outcome can be with the realities of officer suicide. And then in the middle, still negative, you can have this officer who now turns into somebody who's turning into other substances to deal with the stress that's being created here. So in these table teams, the whole key point that you want to get across is it needs to be addressed. We have to have that open conversation, but also we must point out that it's not a one and done approach. It's not, okay, I had that conversation, I could feel better about myself, I'm not going to feel guilty if something happened. Now we're going to have to circle back and see if that officer is taking any of the advice you gave, or has reached out to any of the resources you provided, or that backup, and how they're doing. If it's working great, we're still going to monitor to continue that they're on that right path and they've overcome. If not, we have to have further conversation. You know, why are they still struggling? Is it something more that we can do, or are they going to have to deal with it on their end? Either way, it's through those conversations that we can get to the bottom of what's really going on and work toward that goal of improve well-being for their own sake, the officers, but also in the production line of that officer being able to do their job effectively. Next slide, please. So here, as you see at the lower left, this is going to be a partner activity. You guys can decide how you want to do this in your classes. If you just want to pair them up by the person sitting next to them, if you want to have them choose who their partner is, you handle that however you see fit. What you're going to ask in that partner activity is, what types of calls or situations are more likely to cause a heightened stress response for you? And in that one-on-one with each other, they're going to share what's going to cause a heightened response in their own response to calls. So we see here, I had a bad experience in Meadow Grove, and now I just feel antsy going into that neighborhood. It's a reality, right? They're going to equate the negativity that occurred on that call with any future response to that neighborhood or that specific environment. You know, going back to the domestic violence call with the officer who expressed concern because of their childhood and their upbringing, we need to address this because Greg talked about it. If we're not in our rational minds, we're not making the best decisions. And if we're getting overwhelmed with emotion, you're leaving that officer susceptible to overreacting, not making the best choice. And while you're there, you're going to be sucked into it as well when things go south, and you're going to be the one having to deal with and clean that up. You may have somebody say, I can't stand animal abuse calls, they make me furious. Yes, most people, that's the case, you know, but again, we need to recognize that in ourselves and in those we're working with, because that's a little hint as to what can be problematic going on such calls. And there's an encampment under the 14th Street overpass, and those guys always piss me off. Maybe it's a personal feeling they have toward a group of people. That's something that needs to be addressed and something that has to be the topic of a conversation. If we just ignore it and let's see where it heads, it's something that could be problematic. So the point of this exercise is to recognize and acknowledge we all have those things that bother us individually, and that's normal, right? But what's important is the recognition of them, acknowledging them so that we don't allow them to drive our behavior. If it's up to you guys in this classroom, you folks, that if the conversation's not really going, if you care to share maybe your own personal, I don't want to call them hangups, but things that address you, that little barbs that hit you as these examples, that may open up the dialogue a little bit more, but that's totally up to you if you care to share. You're going to give these participants about 5 minutes in their partner groups and then get responses through and have some great conversation coming out of that. Next slide, please. The final exercise in this group of 3 is an individual activity. And you're going to ask this question: when you're faced with a situation that leads to a heightened stress response, 1, how do you feel? And 2, what kinds of thoughts or emotions do you experience? It's on the emotional side. Now, on the physical side, you're going to ask them too, what do they experience physically? And what type of physical or body reactions do they have in response? So give a couple minutes for them to think about that, take some notes down, and then drive that conversation. So some examples of this: my thoughts start to race and it feels like everything's happening all at once. That's pretty good definition of being overwhelmed. Some may say my palms get sweaty and my mouth gets really dry. All right. Why do we want these officers to do this? Again, it's acknowledging, first off, this is normal, right? The body responds how the body responds. Greg hit on it before. You could train some of this out, but you can't eliminate it completely. So we can't fight it. We need to recognize it, and we have to come up with ways to pivot and respond when these things are occurring. So again, you may want to open this up with your own stories, with your own experiences of what you go through in heightened stress, or if emotions are running high, that may motivate them to get involved and share as well. But again, that's totally up to you how you want to do this. But it's very critical that we have to recognize that this is not just me that experiences this, but everybody in the room, and that A, it's okay, and B, how are we going to look out for one another so that when we see these signs, we can prevent, things from heading south. Now, again, this is going to happen with high stress situations, which Greg is going to get into here, which is the epitome of what we do day in and day out.
Okay, excellent. Appreciate it. Next slide. So this slide right here is really designed to just kind of be a touch slide for your students, because we've already kind of talked about this. So this is really a touch, kind of a recap type of slide. However, this is an important slide because it segues into the next segment, which is to actually start managing those physical responses and staying aware of our surroundings. So, make sure you reiterate to your students that when you notice that the physical indicators that you are experiencing in a heightened stress or heightened state of emotion or heightened response, it's important to maintain your awareness. And in these high stress situations, maintaining those awarenesses, number one, maintain awareness of your surroundings. What's going on around you? What is the initiators that's creating that heightened state of emotion? Noticing your physical response to the situation that is driving that high stress situation, and also noticing the physical response in others, right? So remember, we're talking about the 3 steps of ABLE here, and a part of that is noticing what's happening to self and others, and also the situation. And then, of course, your breathing. We learned from brain science and talking about the amygdala hijack that the more oxygen that goes to your brain in heightened state of emotion, the more that your thinking brain can think clearly or see clearly through a heightened state of emotion. Your body is naturally doing the things that it is designed to do, but you can control some of that, and it comes with your breathing. And Paul's going to revisit some breathing techniques here in a little bit, but that breathing becomes very important to really kind of help to de-stress in these heightened state of emotion type situations. We can go to the next slide, please. And of course, a part of this is staying aware of your surroundings, and that's really the key to maintaining your safety. And so you want to stress to your students that we've already practiced the situation awareness in 8-hour block, and we touched on it again today in a reinforced module. But also let them know and have this discussion about, when you're in stress, you're in high stress situation, it can be hard to stay focused on what is happening around you. And all you got to do is just really kind of think about yourself in heightened state of emotion. I kind of gave that example earlier where I gave the analogy that, someone says, hey, I was so upset, I was so mad, I was seeing red. Well, that's when it's hard to focus because that's all you can see. That cap is kind of blown, that you're not into a low emotional state. And so the oxygen, the brain of your mind is deprived of that oxygen to give you that clear thinking. So reiterate to them that it can be hard to focus on things that happen around you. And it can be helpful to be very intentionally notice what is going on around you, being more focused around what's happening. What are some of the things that you hear? What are you feeling? What do you see? And simply stating these things in your mind can help to bring you into the present moment of the situation. And so as you see here, just with some of these bullet points, when you're stressed, it can be difficult to maintain the awareness around you. If you feel like your focus is starting to slip away, try grounding yourself into specific and concrete things that you feel or that you hear or that you see. And this can also help you to make sure that you are accurately assessing the situation, because there might be some other things that are going on. And we know what tunnel vision looks like, or we call sensory exclusion, when we're so much in a hurry and we're in a heightened state of emotion that we get that tunnel vision. We might not have that full focus view of everything. So it's important to, in these situations, know what's going on in your surroundings, and remember that your safety is always going to be number one. ABLE does not compromise safety. And sometimes, in the classrooms, you may get some students that say, well, you kind of asking me to compromise safety. Well, That's not what's happening here, because safety is always going to be paramount. So make sure that you stress and reiterate that safety is always going to be paramount to not just them, your colleague, but everyone around. That's the number one priority. But we go to the next slide, and let's talk a little bit about managing the physical response, because this can help you to stay focused in stressful situations. And once you know these indicators, you can move on to the next step. So you have notice and the deciding step, and then decide how you're going to address these indicators when they arise. And we talked about that in the 3 steps of ABLE already. And of course, we know in that last step of the 3 steps of ABLE, which is the ACT, is you'll want to deploy some of these strategies when needed. And it can be helpful to practice them in lower stress environments to build up that muscle memory on how you're going to be managing a response in high stress situations. One analogies I always give in the classroom when I'm doing an 8-hour block, and even the trainers, I'll talk about how we train on the range. You know that as an officer, and you have to go to the range to qualify, if that weapon jams, or you have a misfeed, or you have some type of jam, that you normally have tap rack ready, tap rack recover, whatever it is. Universally, it's tap rack, whatever. But you don't have to think about it when you do it, because it's muscle memory. You train so much in doing it, even in low stress situations, that you don't have to think about it. You just automatically do it. And that's what's different here about ABLE. It's about training to do it with attention and doing it consistently through muscle memory. And so managing your physical response can also help you to stay safe in stressful situations. So you recap this here with your students. Know that you have a personal physical indicators of heightened stress and response. Decide to develop strategies to notice and address these indicators. And then lastly is ACT, right? So practicing these strategies on a regular basis so you can deploy them in the field. If we go to the next slide, please, and let's talk a little bit about strategies to managing the physical stress, because this is important as well. And know that these are just some examples, right? There are a lot of common stressors, but this is just some examples and some techniques on how you're going to manage them. And you'll want to think back to your own personal indicators and things that happen with you, and develop the strategies that work well for you personally. Now, we know that it might not work well for everyone else, but if you can kind of understand what's happening in the personal indicators with yourself and help to develop strategies, it helps you to better appropriate how you focus on your colleagues' behavior and indicators and how you can help them. And you may want to develop multiple strategies, right? You don't want to kind of pigeonhole yourself into one specific strategy or approach. You want to have a multi-approach. And that's why we introduced in the 8-hour block different frameworks like the 3Ds and PACT and 3 steps of ABLE, because these are multi-framework approaches that can be used interchangeably given the situation that you're faced with. And so as an example, right, if someone has their thoughts are racing, they just can't calm their mind down, you can also, and this is within yourself and others, practice some breathing exercises, which you're going to do a quick recap on here in a minute. But this helps to get that blood flow to the brain. This is an area for me personally, I had to learn to do as I got later in my career. Sometimes those breathing exercises seems a little corny to some people, but it does help. When I get into high stress situations, I just start trying to breathe. Take a second, take a moment of mindfulness and breathe. Get that oxygen to your brain. So this is a great way to help control the physical stress responses that you're feeling in a heightened state of emotion. Another example could be if someone's hands are shaking, right? So if your hands are shaking because you're so upset, you're so nervous, or you're so in a stressful situation, you want to wiggle your fingers and your toes. Get that blood flow going to your extremities, because all of that blood is now going to areas and preparing. Remember, your body is preparing for a flight, fight, or freeze situation. So it's starting to draw blood from different parts of your body. So there's extremities, your toes, your hands. Those are the extremities of your body. You want to try to get that blood flow going. That helps to get the oxygen going through your body and ultimately to your brain in a heightened state of emotion. And then, of course, I think we all can relate to something like this, where you get upset and you start clenching your jaw. That can often lead to a lot of different things like headache. It could lead to migraines. And so mentally scanning your face for tension and releasing any muscles that are tensed up. Sometimes I have gotten into stressful situations and I noticed that, one side of my face you know, or my cheek might feel like I'm flexing a little bit harder than I need to, like as if I'm stretching that muscle too much. And that's how I know I'm in a stressful situation, because it feels sore afterwards. And that's because I've clenched my jaw, or I'm kind of, you know, in this high tension space. So these breathing exercises and techniques are very important to help with the oxygen. But again, these are just a few examples here of how you can strategize and develop some different strategies to overcome some of these different things. I'm going to turn this over to Paul now, and he's going to review some of the breathing techniques that we covered in the 8-hour block instruction. And these are really great techniques. So you could actually demonstrate this in the classroom as well to kind of revisit this. Paul?
Thanks, Greg. Yes, as Greg said, you know, in that 8-hour curriculum, we gave the example of box breathing, which we're going to get to, but we're going to get into a couple other options. And what's key here is what works best for you and what works best for your officers that you're going to be teaching this to, this refresher training. You know, maybe a couple of them work better than others. It's, again, a lot of things is what best works for the officer, the individual, as well as yourself. Awareness is this first step. Paying attention to your breath, it's going to help your rate of breathing. Remember, we talk a lot about acknowledgement. You know, we know when our breathing is out of battery, and that's a first sign. So what do we have to do? We have to regain control to the best of our ability. When our breathing's off, that's going to affect the heart rate, and those other physical symptoms of stress are going to enter into the picture. That's why that tunnel vision, that sensory exclusion comes in. These are, again, your body's response to the perceived threat or the actual threat that's before you. So we're going to give the officers in our class options on breathing. Some may take a little bit more time, but the bottom line, as Greg hit on, was restoring oxygen to the brain is going to take away those blinders, take away that tunnel vision. It's going to return that rational thought, maybe not fully, but it's going to increase that. And there's many ways that we could do this. These techniques are used by U.S. Marines, by firearms instructors, by law enforcement around the world. And controlling your breathing in any stressful situation can help improve your concentration and enhance your situational awareness. To the example of, it doesn't need to be an entire exercise out in the field, even if a training environment. Before we clear a room, before you move, take a breath, move, clear that room. Before you exit that room, take a breath, move. There's a reason for that, right? Because if we don't, when we start clearing, and we don't breathe, our vision gets more narrow, our heart rate's going to go up. And that's when mistakes are made. So it could just be a moment to take a step back, take a large breath. This is why we stress when we intervene, say the direct approach. Hey, bud, give me a second, right? Step them back. You handle what's in front. Let that person scream at you. That gives them a moment to take a breath, to regain their composure, to return to that rational thought. It is proven effective. We're going to get into the strategies in a moment, but at the end of the program, there's going to be a survey, but there's also going to be a QR code that is a resource for you folks as well as your students that'll give them resources on different breathing techniques that we're going to cover here. All right. What's great about these two is they can be done quickly without drawing attention to anything. Take that step back if you can. You can even do it in the moment. We all know what it feels like when we're starting to lose that control. And again, this is that first sign. That's that awareness where we come in and start these breathing principles. We can go to that next slide. So I mentioned the box breathing, which was in the 8-hour block, right? Breathe in for the count of 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, and hold your breath again for 4. And you can repeat that process. You can count your breaths, breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, counting each of your inhales. When you reach 5, start again at 1. What are we doing? We're reorienting our focus and we're restoring that critical oxygen that our brain and our body needs. As you continue on, you see if you can increase the amount of time it takes you to get back to 5 by lengthening your breaths. You're bringing in more, you're exhaling, more oxygen's coming in. So we got box breathing, we got the counting of the breaths. You can add a pause, breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. But after you've been inhaled, pause for a moment before exhaling. Hold it. After you exhale, pause for a moment before inhaling. Again, we're getting back on that proper battery, and so that we're not breathing heavy and out of control. The final one is the double inhale. You can breathe in through your nose, but without exhaling, you want to take another deeper breath in. It's bringing more and more air into your lungs, which is going to go up to the brain and hopefully, or it will, increase that rational thought. After a brief pause, you're going to exhale through your pursed lips. Now it's going to be a little bit closed and let it out, and you can keep doing that a couple times. Right, so count your breaths, box breathing, add a pause, double inhale. These are going to be in that QR code. It's going to be, we're coming to the end soon, and you'll have that for yourselves and for your students. Next slide, please. What's key here is to find what works best for you and to get across to your students what works best for them. Right? If it doesn't work for them, throw it out. We don't want them to waste their time and put them through an exercise that's pointless. But one of these, in all likelihood, is going to work for them if they practice it. Try these strategies out in a safe and relaxed environment, right? You don't want to do this for the first time out in the field. I mean, if it comes to that, it can't do any harm, but become familiar with the process through practice. If you come up with something better, something else works great for you, share that with your class and keep doing it, right? Everybody's an individual. Everybody has their own needs. Find what works best for you and stick with it. Practice those techniques that work best for you on a regular basis. And we're building that muscle memory Greg talked of. So when you're in that high stress situation, it'll come to you naturally. So these are the ways to overcome when you're starting to catch yourself. You know, you're getting a little agitated, your breathing's getting out of battery, how to restore that back. Greg is going to go into one of the most important pieces of this entire program, and that is culture. And we're going to be wrapping up in a moment. Just again, a peek behind the curtain. We went through a lot of those exercises. Keep in mind, this is a 2-hour program. Each of those exercises is going to run about 5 to 7 minutes on how they're sitting in their groups and coming up with their responses and their notes. And then you would have your discussion time. So we are going to end a little bit before that 2-hour window, but keep in mind, those 5 to 7 minutes are going to add up, and that's what's going to fill that gap to bring you to 2 hours. Great.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Paul. And definitely a good reminder there. As I mentioned very early on, you remember there are segments here. So as you look into your facilitator's guide, you'll notice that these last few slides here focus on the importance of culture, because the importance of culture plays a critical role in any event, any intervention, and as well as a department-wide implementation. But for the purposes of this curriculum, this reinforced module, we're focusing on early intervention. And so it was great, just like we did in the final portions of the 8-hour curriculum, is to talk about how this can be implemented and how you can change culture. And we know that changing culture doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen in a vacuum, but it does eventually change. And it's those micro interventions, those micro successes that really change what the department or agency looks like and how you can change the culture and overcome those challenges. And so building a culture of early intervention is what we're going to be focused on these last few slides here. And of course, we know that this training is important. That's why we're all here, right? We know this is important for the organization. But at the end of the day, every personnel, all members must feel comfortable with both giving and receiving intervention at the earliest sign to help and provide the help that's needed. And of course, in order to do that, you got to overcome those inhibitors that we talk about. Really, the agency culture, as we all know, is shaped by really its people and it's folks that make up that culture. And so let's go to the next slide. And in this next slide, this is actually going to be the last table exercise. This is going to be where you send them out to their groups to have some discussions. And this is going to be a quick 4 to 5 minute discussion at best in the small groups. And then you'll come back for a larger discussion. And the question that you're posing to the group is what role can you play in encouraging and supporting early intervention? So we'll ask you all here in the group just so we can put this to practice a little bit. Kristen, what role can you play in encouraging and supporting early intervention?
Well, one role is to offer or to invite others to actively intervene on your behalf. If they feel that you're out of control, that you're starting to get there, that they're noticing the initial signs of agitation, that just their invitation to intervene on you may lead them to be more accepting of intervention or more willing to intervene on others as well.
Yeah, I like it. Very, very, really good stuff there. So what you were talking about, Kristen, is also giving permission to intervene, right? Having that discussion with your colleague and saying, hey, look, it's okay. If you see me getting out of line here, you see me getting the highest state of emotion, hey, I want you to say something, intervene on me, or help to guide me in the right direction, because I might not be able to see clearly because I'm in a heightened state of emotion. Absolutely love it. Good stuff. And that's one of the great responses that you also want to get back from your group. Joel, how about you? Could you give us another one? What role can you play in encouraging and supporting early intervention?
I would say by always having that positive attitude and supporting this able mindset. More importantly, not going into the negative, not allowing yourself to be negative.
Yeah.
To let your peers or your coworkers or whoever, your friends, see that you've got a chink in your armor. Be positive around them all the time.
Yeah. And Joe, it's difficult to be positive sometimes because culture can be so pervasive that it doesn't allow that environment sometimes when you have some folks that are not necessarily positive, right? So having that positive attitude and being able to have discussions and fostering that really helps to change. So really appreciate your responses. And you all hit on a few responses that we may be getting, that you may get in the class. If we go to the next slide, and kind of look at this as kind of two components, right? Because you have your leader's role and then you have what everyone else's role is. So let's start off with talking about your leader's role. And this is a good discussion to have with your class, especially if you have supervisors there in the room. And it goes back to what we talked about in the 8-hour curriculum, is that if you have supervisors that are in the classroom, it is a great way to get them to reinforce their support of intervention and this program and really helping to change that culture. So supervising other leaders can support the culture of early intervention by, number one, giving your officers permission to intervene on you and accepting interventions, right? So that's kind of what Christian was talking about, giving that permission to intervene. You also want to have a discussion with them about recognizing officers who intervene and accept an intervention. So it may not necessarily be a public thing. You may not want to necessarily put this on display. This could be a private discussion of recognition. Also, regular check-ins with officers and encouraging them to check in with each other. So remember when we talked about the intervention time-based framework, we talked about early in an event, before the event, later in the event, and after the event. There's still time to do things even after an event, but there's also a follow-up. So there's regular check-ins, and it doesn't have to be an extensive conversation. It can just be, hey, partner, I'm just checking to make sure you're okay. And that's it. You can just have a casual conversation with them just to check in to see where they are. You should be able to tell where they were before and where they are now just based on that check-in. So this is a really great thing to talk about in technique, and hopefully that comes out in discussion. And lastly, talking openly about the health and wellness and making sure that officers are aware of all available resources. We know that in the law enforcement profession, one of the toughest challenges that we have is the officer wellness piece. And we are addressing that, obviously, but it can be difficult for folks to talk about. We know that some folks in law enforcement suffer in silence. And so having those open discussions about health and wellness helps to promote a culture that makes that discussion a little bit more easier, whereas before it may not have been as easy to have a conversation about. And then the other part of this is what everyone's role is. And we go to the next slide, please, and talk about what everyone else's role is outside of the leaders, right? So giving and accepting intervention, just like with the leaders, giving that permission to intervene, talking openly about interventions you can give and receive. So in other words, you're having some open discussion about it. And if you're not already doing it at your agency, it may be a great idea to maybe just in your roll calls or whatever medium that you use to have early discussions before a shift, to just spend maybe 2 to 3 minutes just openly talking about intervention techniques. Or this could be something that's done in private as well, and sharing how those interventions have impacted you. We've heard from agencies already that are dying to share some of their intervention success stories, and they're actually discussing it in their roll calls and in their agencies. And this is what has been shared with me from some agencies that I've interacted with. So having those good open discussions sometimes, or it may be private, you decide, or your colleagues can decide, can be good ways in order to change the culture. And then sharing your personal strategies and your tips for managing your own wellness. Those are great things. I'm not into yoga, but I have started getting into a little bit more mindfulness stuff. So some folks have actually talked to me personally about yoga, but more or less into meditation. And so I have kind of gravitated a little bit more into meditation because someone suggested it. They talked about it. They talked about the benefits. And so by them sharing their personal strategies and their tips, that actually helped to manage my own wellness. And so that is a great piece for your students to talk about if they're not already doing it, and see what works for them. Not every strategy is going to work. Not every technique is going to work, but maybe they can pull something away from it. And then lastly, one of the other roles that everyone has is to making time to check in with your fellow officers on a regular basis. Again, just like as we talked about with the supervisors, having those check-ins, just, hey, partner, you good? Hey, I'm just checking on you. I just want to make sure you're okay. Those check-ins can be really important, especially if someone is suffering in silence. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, and this is the last slide in the reinforced module. As Paul talked about, and I'm looking at the time right now, we're at about almost 12:30. So we're at about an hour and a half. So if you factor in maybe a break or two, and you factor in some of those table discussions, it will take you to the entire 2 hours. So, as you can see here, we covered kind of a walkthrough and interaction in about an hour and a half. So you can see that the time will actually be filled with the 2-hour reinforce. And this is a great thank you here at the end. And of course, as Paul talked about, his QR code there to go over some of the breathing techniques. And those breathing techniques, again, if you're not already doing them, have your students try them on a regular basis, because they are important and it really helps you in that space when you're in a heightened state of emotion. So that is the 2-hour reinforced module. We hope that you all found this beneficial. I think we want to kind of move now into a Q&A session and open the floor for any questions. Lindy, I don't know if you want to lead that discussion or not, but we'll go ahead and open it up. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to come off of mute and let us know what's on your mind. Any questions that you may have about the curriculum, the reinforced module, the initial 8-hour, or ABLE as a whole.
Hello.
Yes.
This is Ramona. I am still having issues with the students that are civilian. They still not, they feel like everything's really about the sworn in ABLE. They're hardly mentioned. They really don't understand why they're even having to take the course.
Okay. All right. Well, Ramona, thank you for sharing that with us. We really appreciate that feedback, and we've heard that feedback, and I'll have Lindy or anyone chime in if they'd like to. We are working on a couple of different components within the 8-hour curriculum that that incorporate some of the non-sworn or civilian aspect of law enforcement. However, I will say that part of how you deliver this also, with mindfulness of keeping those non-sworn or civilian as a part of the discussion, becomes important. So I know oftentimes when I'm in a class, especially if I'm in trainer, is I will interchange them. I will mindfully talk about the folks that are civilian and sworn. And if you look at the base of the framework in and of itself, it doesn't matter whether you're sworn or whether you're a civilian. It's about the technique. It's about how it can help someone. And that's something that can be conveyed. But we definitely recognize your concern. And it's something that we are working on in some of our updates and iteration of the curriculum going forward in 2024. I don't know if Lindy or Paul, if you want to chime in, you had anything additional to talk about.
Greg, I would just say too, that to their point, I can see their confusion, but the health and wellness component on its own is a massive part that we can start relating to as well, because it's not just the job that can create the stress that leads us down that path. It could be just in general, it could be stressors of life. So promoting that health and wellness and really maybe tying that to a civilian example could aid in that. I know it's challenging because they're in a room most likely with sworn and they see themselves differently, but one approach we've taken is it's one team, one fight. We're all in this together. So if you're seeing something, maybe that civilian has a different viewpoint, whereas on the officer side, they're not seeing it, or vice versa. So that's why we need one another. It's just something we've been sharing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what you both just said. And yeah, like Greg mentioned, we have heard that from a lot of people. We are working on putting together some case studies and some role plays that would incorporate non-sworn folks as well, that each agency would essentially choose depending on whether they have non-sworn folks mixed into their group or if they're doing just just individual courses with just non-sworn staff, they would be able to choose which case studies and which role plays they do based on what their classroom is going to look like. We don't have that yet. We're working on it. But in the meantime, I think there are lots of spaces, like Paul and Greg just said, that you can incorporate that. But at this point, it would be on you as an instructor to kind of identify where those spaces are and make sure that you're kind of addressing some of those things that might come up for civilian staff in addition to sworn.
And Lindy, I'll add to that. And I'll just give an example of one of those spaces that she's talking about. Oftentimes, when I get to talking about primary and secondary trauma, right, you all remember that segment as we start to talk about what's happening to us in those heightened state of emotions. That is a great space to really incorporate both the non-sworn and sworn side of the discussion, because, and I always use kind of like maybe a dispatcher or someone in a 911 call center or a call taker. They experience a lot of stress. They may not necessarily be experiencing what an officer is experiencing on the street, but they also experience an heightened stress that maybe the officers or those in the street don't necessarily hear or see. And then, of course, if an officer goes down or there's an emergency or they have to hit that alert tone, they're trying to condition themselves to be in a better space. They experience fight, flight, or freeze because they hear the yelling on the radio. They hear the sirens happening. They have the benefit of hearing the other side of the 911 call, which, however that call came in, can be stressful in and of itself. So as Lindy talked about, finding those little opportunities are fantastic. Another opportunity and another window is in the role plays. In these role plays, you could actually try to work on some of those barriers as well, or those inhibitors. And sworn and non-sworn is actually an inhibitor as well, as we talked about in the block of instruction. So really appreciate that feedback. And as we mentioned, I mean, it's a great way to find these little nuggets as we are, as Lindy talked about, preparing to roll out some additional information for those in civilian non-sworn.
Greg, if I could just add one more thing, when we're talking about, especially with dispatch, we'll acknowledge that sometimes the non-sworn side or the dispatchers in particular are often left out of the conversation, so we're kind of acknowledging how they feel and where they're coming from and puts them in a better headspace. And maybe it opens their minds a little bit to the program, because again, there is that us versus them. They don't care about us. They're out doing their thing and we're in here. So acknowledging that feeling, I think, helps out as well. And we certainly can do a better job, but to Greg's example with the shots fired call or an officer in need of assistance, take a CPR call on an infant. I mean, we've seen it so many times that just can destroy a dispatcher, especially if nobody goes in to check up on them and follow up. So a lot of parallels there. They're not as evident, but as Greg said, correctly, we got to find some of those similarities and highlight them.
Christian, I saw you had your hand up earlier. Did you want to go next?
No, you actually addressed what I was going to ask, incorporating this into particularly dispatchers, animal control, parking enforcement. So thanks a lot. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Any other questions? These are fantastic questions and discussions, so really appreciate it. And of course, this is recorded, so those who may have missed it at your agency, let them know that they can access this in instructor portal when it becomes available. And some of these questions may be questions that they may have had. So this is fantastic discussion. Any other questions? Okay, Lindy, I'll pass the baton over to you for closeout.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for being here.